Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Julia Holter called Aviary. It feels like it's been longer since the last Julia Holter album than just 3 years. And I know that sounds a little bit strange, given that I don't really talk about her all that much. I discovered her discography late in 2015 before giving her album that year, Have You in My Wilderness, a spot on my year-end list of the best albums of that year. But I'll freely admit that outside of a few choice songs, it's not an album I revisit often. Most because it's an odd album for me to take in. It's beautifully effervescent, but also layered and complicated and impressively nuanced, which makes it the sort of listening experience that's both very light and very heavy simultaneously, which actually makes her 2013 album, Loud City Song, an easier listen to go back to just for emotional continuity and a slightly more approachable style and message. I've typically said that Julia Holter's music is Lana Del Rey done right in Baroque pop, but upon more thought, I'm not really sure it's the most apt comparison. More like Lana Del Rey with more intricacy and density, and I'll freely admit that's not for everybody. Sometimes you just want the straightforward pop. And if I wanted proof of all that, I decided to look at Julia Holter's newest project, a daunting 15-song, hour-and-a-half double album that she's described as her most layered and expansive to date, reportedly inspired by the chaotic, screaming reality of the past couple of years, especially in 2018, which seemed like an interesting choice for Julia Holter. I've never quite considered her music contemporary, and by that I mean connected to current events and ideas. She seemed more comfortable with abstraction and philosophy and loftier themes, very much in the art school vein, but hey, at the very least I had to respect the ambition. So what did we get from Aviary? Alright, to describe my impression of this album, I'm going to reference something that I'm fairly certain a fair chunk of you hadn't experienced, for better or for worse, but was an impression I couldn't quite shake the more listens I gave this album. So imagine, if you will, you're going to a very high-end performance art exhibit, lots of wine and cheese, where the artist pulls out all the stops to put forward a very important message. And when you finish with the exhibit, you can indeed conclude that that was a potent message, and that all the stops were very much indeed pulled out. But you also got the impression in the back of your mind that the entire event was overlong, under-arranged, a little chaotic, and likely wildly over budget, especially when you realize that it's a message that didn't quite require all the pomp and circumstance. That was my impression with Aviary, a fascinating listen that definitely hit some interesting points with some beautiful poetry, but they're all points that I've heard in more direct fashion and media, and any attempt at profundity is completely handicapped by the execution. I'm almost tempted to call this an experiment that's failed outright. Except for knowledge that on a thematic level, this double album does mostly pull off what it's trying to do, just in a way that means I'm in no hurry to revisit it, and will likely alienate a lot of audiences coming over from Have You in My Wilderness. I mean, it's got an audience, it is interesting, but it's not a pop audience, let's just say that. So, context for all this, and we have to start with theme for any of this to make sense. Julia Holter has described this project on a thematic level, exploring the increasingly dense, claustrophobic, and contradictory nature of modern life, with compositions partially driven off of improvisation. And man, you can tell. And you know, I've got to give her some props for building her thematic core as an implicit defense against criticism of this album, as the question of how we grow comfortable with these contradictions in life by embracing ambiguity and subtlety. It also kind of acts as a challenge to critics like myself to grow more accustomed to the clashing, dissonant elements on the project and accept more of its ambiguity in its lyrics. So, alright, there's a point to be made about experimentation and desensitization, I get that, which enables one to accept nuance in an increasingly chaotic world, and yet there are some major issues with this project, and the first can be demonstrated with a cut that's very early on. Every Day is an Emergency, which spends half the song with wailing instrumentation, including bagpipes simulating klaxons and sirens, before the scant lyrics highlight a primitive animal instinct that comes forth from the chaotius, an old word for a miserable wretch who's driven back by all that chaos and confusion. But wait a minute, doesn't this directly contradict the main theme of the album in finding ascendancy and comfort in ambiguity and chaos, when instead there is a regression to the baser self? But that's the conscious, rational, critical thinking response. The irrational response for me is how it reminds me of the nice fracking fluid injection from Shaking the Habitual in 2013, where the production brings forth really obvious symbolism and tries to paint it as being so much more profound than it really really is. And while I'm not going to bring out my 3 Ps for political art, power, precision, populism, you've heard it before, because I'm not really sure this album has an explicitly conscious aim, I will say it's hard to avoid a sense that in execution, the album wants to avoid really dealing with any ambiguity that's grounded in real-world situations. And it starts off early too, taking the shimmering, gauzy iconography across weather and Chiatius that shows whenever a hard position is asked of that audience, there's a devolution to muddled deflection, and amidst the increased chatter on vocissimo, it begins to sound almost outright nihilistic that it can't be better, you devolve into this. It's not so much finding comfort in ambiguity so much as recoiling into numbness and a lesser, more craven state amidst the chaos where on songs like I Would Rather See and Colligere, humanity wishes to see the heavenly presence reduced and brought down to their level, only redeemed for a higher state of mind by the choice to show empathy on Words I Heard and I Shall Love One, and even then it's last ditch. Or to translate all this, Julia Holter isn't elevating empathy and love so much as the messy humanity proves increasingly incapable of it unless they're at their lowest point and they got nowhere else to turn. And hey, you want evidence of feral, pack-minded viciousness devoid of any sort of empathy and unwilling to engage in a greater sense of nuance, I can point you to the average Twitter thread or YouTube comment section, hopefully not the one below. Be safe, you guys. It's not really all that profound though, and that's not even getting to the presumed elevation of ambiguity and nuance that's demanded to take in the execution of this message, mostly because it seems to operate at cross purposes to the message itself. I mean, think about it. The philosophical arc of this album shows humanity in some form devolving to its most base and craven level when asked to take a stand. And yet, in order to comprehend that arc on the album, Julia Holter demands the much smaller audience that absolutely fancies itself as being more cultured and high-minded for this album show a comfort for subtlety and ambiguity in the execution of the record that the subjects of the album's arc at large would actively avoid until there's no other choice. And I'll say it, not only is this message about the furthest thing from populist, it feels really pompous and self-serving and kind of pretentious, both helped and hindered by Holter herself inserting herself as a primary figure of the story, which feels like an awkward point of reference that her classically trained delivery really doesn't support. I just don't buy her in that role. And that makes the regression in the face of empathy or nuance feel kind of short-sighted, ironically lacking in the sort of nuance that doesn't try to offer an explanation why people recoil from complicated truths, or ask to share or love others, why they back away, but instead presents it like a universal truth of humanity that doesn't bother to go deeper. And if this is her high-minded case for describing the shrieking modern hell of mainstream tribalism, well, for as much as it tries to present a case for empathy, it ironically shows so little empathy itself, and that's a major issue. Hell, if anything, it feels like the plea for ambiguity is more of a deflection from the fact that when you get into the execution of Aviary, for the most part we're dealing with a mess. Initially, I was prepared to offer a defense of the double album length that is designed to simulate the exhaustion of that cacophonous environment, but that's really only the case for the first disc of the album. The second's a little bit more composed and a little bit more structured, although not enough to avoid the suspicion that this could have easily been trimmed down with the focus on some internal logic. Hell, that probably could have helped the improvisation and the composition as well, because we're not really dealing with songs here with hooks or structured verses so much as a lot of free-form poetry that barely holds to whatever foundations that are here. And just like Kurt Weill's Bottle It In, it's an open toss-up whether they're going to be live drums or programmed percussion, or whether or not the synths will integrate well with all the strings or the horns or the guitars or even the bagpipes, and all of it is operating on the assumption that the pickups are mixed in a way that doesn't clip against the side of the mix or sound good at all. And when you have often such clean, multi-track vocals that gain their power based upon their delicacy and beauty, that sort of production discombobulation, that's a real problem. And yes, of course some of this is explicitly intended to draw a clash with progressions that create dissonance, but if I'm making a comparison to, say, the works of Anna Meredith or even Bjork's Utopia, of which the opening track here strikes a very sharp resemblance, really this album has a lot in common with Utopia, there's at least a semblance of structure or consistent melodic progression on those albums, or at very least a groove to drive some sort of momentum. Whereas with Aviary, alright, look, I won't deny that there's some isolated songs that can build pretty well. Julia Holter's still a unique composer, and while it's absolutely never consistent, there are some gorgeous moments that save it. The most obvious is I Shall Love Too, primed as a single as much as anything could be on this album, and for good reason. The heavenly swell with the strings and the fizzy tap of the beat playing off the bass and the slightly wonky melody, it works, it sounds great. Hell, it's no surprise that they opted for a reprise of it much later with I Shall Love 1, or that they took a similar fizzy tap of the percussion on Leisure to You, which probably has one of the more stable grooves and conventional structures on the project. Even though I like Weather thanks to the horns, it goes in a similar lane, but I'm not as much of a fan of the blocky snare drum against the beeping synth, a similar off-kilter vibe that manages to translate to Underneath the Moon. And look, as much as the content really frustrated me on Words I Heard, the strings arrangement is genuinely beautiful, and when you've got the lo-fi keyboards and the fragmented touches behind Why Sad Song the Closer and In Garden's Muteness, there are some achingly potent, just raw melodies here. And I really like the dramatic build behind I Would Rather See. It captures that desire to bring the heavens low that is really powerful and impactful. And that's the real frustrating thing about Aviary, because I'd struggle to say it's outright bad or a failure. The second disc is a lot easier to digest than the first, sure, but I still respect Julia Holter's ambition, from her thematic reaches to her compositions and the production. This is an album that is designed to be challenging, and on some level, it delivers a coherent message with some really striking poetry. But on the other hand, if there is a project that is screaming out for an editor, it is absolutely this one. It runs a lot longer than it should or really needs to. The clash of tones and lack of structure brings some really inconsistent returns, and maybe a more populist or consistent approach to the themes would connect more strongly with a broader audience. And what genuinely saddens me is that most people won't bother to dig deeper and draw the line through the tangled subconscious in that poetry, and they'll absolutely get the reviews of, well, I won't say I get it, but I absolutely have to love it. It's so deep, right? And while the mountains of ambiguity will forever prevent a clear picture of this album, I parse out enough to really solidify my opinion at least. Strong 6 out of 10, diehard fans only. And if you're expecting any pop concessions, this is emphatically not for you. But otherwise, hell, if you got an hour and a half to sink into some challenging Baroque neoclassical improvisation, this might be for you, but pretty much nobody else. And at the end of the day, that might wind up being the real problem. Let's see what happens. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I can imagine this review got pretty convoluted and dense and philosophical. That kind of happens with Julia Holter. It happened in the last one too. I try to make it as easy to follow as possible, but again, this album's not easy to follow, so it's kind of confusing. If you want to stream or buy it, links down there below, but if you think you got it, the poll's right there. Y'all can tell me how wrong I am. And even then, I think this album's kind of dense. I'm not sure how many people will ever get a firm grasp on it. Not even Julia Holter, as she described most of it coming from her own subconscious desires. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process or help support the channel, link to my Patreon's right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote for my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors gets to add albums, movies, or even a top 10 list to that schedule. More details right over there, but until then, you want to see my schedule, it's on my Instagram, link down there below. But till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.